You can't understand Western political thought without starting here, with this man, Plato. Born around 428 BC in Athens, right in the middle of one of the most turbulent periods in Greek history. The Peloponnesian War was tearing the Greek world apart. Democracy in Athens was unstable. Demagogues were rising.
And then, the event that changed everything for Plato, the trial and execution of Socrates, his teacher, his mentor, the man he considered the most just person in Athens, put to death by a democratic jury. That moment shaped everything Plato wrote after. He didn't just grieve, he diagnosed.
He looked at Athenian democracy, the system that killed Socrates, and he asked a question that still cuts deep. Can the masses really be trusted to govern? Can popular opinion ever be a reliable foundation for justice? His answer was no. And from that answer, Plato built one of the most ambitious political philosophies ever conceived. Not in a vacuum, not as abstract theory, but as a direct response to the political chaos he lived through. Athens had experienced oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, sometimes within the span of a few years. Plato watched all of it. He saw how factions destroyed cities, how unchecked ambition corroded institutions, how rhetoric could manipulate entire populations into disastrous decisions. So he didn't just write philosophy, he wrote political philosophy, with urgency, with purpose. His major political works, the Republic, the Statesman, the Laws, aren't dusty academic texts, they're interventions. Plato argues that politics with philosophy is blind, that governance without wisdom leads to ruin, that the central question isn't just who holds power, but whether the person holding power actually knows what's good. And that question, it hasn't gone away. Every debate about expertise versus populism, every argument about who's qualified to lead, every tension between individual freedom and collective order, Plato was there first. He didn't just raise these questions, he built entire frameworks to answer them. But here's what makes Plato truly remarkable. He wasn't a utopian dreamer detached from reality. He was a man scarred by political failure, a man who watched his city destroy its best citizen. And instead of walking away from politics, he walked straight into it, with his pen, with his academy, with a body of work that's still shaping how we think about power, justice, and the state, over 2,000 years later. Plato doesn't just theorize about politics, he builds a city from the ground up in dialogue. The Republic, arguably his most ambitious work, isn't merely a philosophical text about justice, it's a blueprint, a full architectural plan for the perfect state. And he constructs it to answer one deceptively simple question: what does a just society actually look like? His answer is radical and deeply uncomfortable. Plato argues that the ideal state mirrors the structure of the human soul. He identifies three parts of the soul: reason, spirit, and appetite. So he designs three corresponding classes in the state: the rulers, who govern through wisdom; the auxiliaries, warriors who protect the city with courage; and the producers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, who sustain its material life. That's it. That's the entire architecture. Clean, hierarchical, non-negotiable. And justice? For Plato, justice is not about individual rights. It's not about freedom. It's not about equality. Justice is harmony, each part performing its proper function. The rational element leads. The spirited element defends. The appetitive element provides. When every class does what it's naturally suited to do, and only that, the state is just. But the moment one class oversteps, disorder, decay. Plato is blunt about this. A city where producers try to rule is a city already in decline. A city where warriors seize power devolves into tyranny of brute force. Order, for Plato, isn't one value among many, it's the foundation of everything. And here's what really separates him from modern political thinking. He doesn't start with the individual, he starts with the whole. The state isn't some social contract between free people protecting self-interest. For Plato, the state is an organism, a living body, and like any organism, it only functions when every part serves the larger whole. He also insists on something most people today would reject outright. Specialization is absolute. You don't choose your role based on desire or ambition. You're placed based on nature, on aptitude, on what your soul is built for. Plato argues that a cobbler should cobble, a soldier should fight, and a philosopher should rule. This isn't democracy, not even close. Plato has no interest in the will of the majority. He's interested in the good of the city, and those two things, he warns, are rarely the same. The ideal state isn't built on freedom, it's built on function, on order, on the conviction that the best society is one where the wisest lead, the bravest protect, and everyone else does exactly what they were born to do. Of all Plato's ideas, this one cuts the deepest. He argues, with complete conviction, that the only people fit to rule are philosophers. Not politicians, not generals, not the wealthy. Philosophers. Those who have seen the truth. Those who understand the form of the good. This is the Philosopher-King, and it might be the most dangerous political idea ever put forward. Here's Plato's logic. Governing requires knowledge, real knowledge, not opinion, not popularity, not the ability to win votes. Knowledge of what is genuinely good, for the individual and for the city. And who possesses that? Only the philosopher, the one who spent a lifetime training the mind, disciplining desire, ascending from illusion to truth. Think about the allegory of the cave. Most people, Plato says, are prisoners, chained in darkness, mistaking shadows for reality. The philosopher is the one who breaks free, who climbs out, who sees the sun, the form of the good, and finally grasps the world as it truly is. And then, he must go back down, back into the cave, back among the prisoners. Not because he wants to, but because it's his duty. The one who sees must lead. Plato argues that philosophers must be compelled to rule. They won't seek power, and that's exactly what makes them qualified. The person who desires authority is, by definition, unfit for it. Only the reluctant ruler, bound by obligation to truth, can be trusted with the city. But here's where it gets dangerous. Who decides who the philosopher is? Who determines who has truly seen the good? Plato never fully answers this, and that silence has echoed through centuries. Every authoritarian regime that ever claimed to rule for the people's own good, whether they knew it or not, was borrowing from this playbook. He opens a door that can never be closed. The idea that some people are simply more qualified to govern, by nature, by training, by insight, strikes at the very root of democratic governance. And Plato doesn't flinch. He embraces it. Democracy, in his view, is a system where the ignorant choose leaders based on charm, not competence, where freedom becomes license, where every opinion counts equally, whether informed or utterly delusional. The Philosopher-King is his answer. One ruler, guided by reason, uncorrupted by desire, bound not to the people's wishes, but to the truth itself. It's elegant, it's logical, and it's terrifying, because if you accept Plato's premise, that most people don't know what's good for them, then democracy isn't liberation, it's self-destruction. That's the weight of this idea, and 24 centuries later, we're still wrestling with it. In Plato's ideal city-state, society isn't a free-for-all. It's not a place where anyone can do anything they want. No, Plato divides his republic into 3 distinct classes, and each one has a specific role, a specific virtue, and a specific part of the soul it corresponds to. First, the rulers, the philosopher-kings. These are the individuals governed by reason. Their virtue is wisdom. They see clearly. They understand the forms. And because of that, they alone are fit to lead. Second, the guardians, the warriors. These are governed by spirit. Their virtue is courage. They defend the city. They enforce its laws. They protect what the rulers have built. Third, the producers, farmers, artisans, merchants. These are governed by appetite. Their virtue is moderation, temperance. They provide the material needs of the city: food, goods, commerce. Now here's the key. Plato argues that justice in a city exists when each class performs its own function and doesn't interfere with the others. That's it. That's his definition of political justice. A just society for Plato is one where everyone does what they're naturally suited to do, not what they feel like doing, what they're built for. And he ties this directly to his theory of the soul. Just as the individual soul has 3 parts, reason, spirit, and appetite, so does the city. The city is the soul writ large. And when each part does its job, harmony, order, justice. But when it doesn't, chaos, corruption, collapse. So here's where Plato draws a hard line. He rejects equality in terms of roles, flatly. Not everyone is fit to rule, and that's not a flaw in his system, it's the design. Plato doesn't see this as oppression, he sees it as natural order. Some souls are oriented toward wisdom, others toward honor, others toward material desire, and the city must be organized accordingly. He warns explicitly that when unqualified people rise to power, the entire state suffers. When appetite rules where reason should, you get tyranny, you get decay, you get a city that eats itself from the inside out. This isn't elitism for its own sake. Plato genuinely believes that misplaced ambition is the root of political ruin. The wrong person in the wrong role doesn't just fail individually, they drag the whole city down with them. That's the architecture of Plato's just city. Rigid? Yes, but to him, it's the only thing that works. Plato places enormous emphasis on education, what the Greeks called paideia. In fact, Books 2 through 3 and Book 7 of the Republic are heavily focused on it, and for good reason. To Plato, the fate of the city depends entirely on how its citizens, especially its future rulers, are educated. Get that wrong, and everything falls apart. But here's where Plato gets controversial, deeply controversial. He advocates for strict censorship of art, poetry, and music, and not loosely. He means it. Why? Because Plato believes that stories shape character directly. If children grow up hearing tales of gods lying, cheating, fighting among themselves, behaving with cruelty and cowardice, they'll imitate that behavior. They'll absorb it. It becomes their moral framework before they even know what morality is. So, what does he propose? Banning poets like Homer from the ideal city? Yes, Homer, the most revered storyteller in all of Greece. Plato argues he must go, not because Plato hates art, but because he fears its power. Art moves people. It bypasses reason and strikes straight at the emotions. And for Plato,
that's a threat.
He goes further. He argues that art imitates the world of appearances, which itself is already a copy of the true reality, the forms. So art is twice removed from truth. It's a copy of a copy, and that makes it dangerous. It doesn't lead the soul toward knowledge, it pulls it further away. But Plato doesn't just tear things down, he builds. He outlines a rigorous education system for the guardians and rulers. Physical training to discipline the body, mathematics to sharpen the mind, and ultimately, dialectic, the highest form of intellectual pursuit. All of it designed with one purpose, to turn the soul toward the good. And this is where the famous allegory of the cave becomes essential. Plato uses it to illustrate what education really is. He argues that education isn't about filling an empty mind with facts. It's about turning the whole soul, reorienting it from darkness to light, from the shadows on the cave wall to the sun outside, from ignorance to the form of the good. That's a radical claim. Education, for Plato, isn't instruction, it's transformation. And without it, no ruler can rule justly, no city can stand. Plato doesn't just build his ideal state and walk away. He does something far more unsettling. He shows exactly how it falls apart. In Book 8 of the Republic, Plato lays out 5 forms of government, 5 regimes, arranged in a descending order, a political decay, a slow rot from the best to the absolute worst. And the terrifying part? He argues this progression isn't random. It's inevitable. At the top sits aristocracy, rule by the best. The philosopher-kings govern with wisdom, the guardians protect with courage, and the producers work with discipline. Everyone in their place. The state functions like a healthy body. But Plato warns, even this can't last forever. Why? Because human nature creeps in. The rulers eventually fail to maintain the perfect breeding and education cycles. Cracks appear, and the descent begins. The first fall is into timocracy, a government driven by honor and military glory. Think Sparta. Plato argues that when the rational element weakens, the spirited part takes over. The rulers stop loving wisdom. They start loving victory. Ambition replaces philosophy. It's not the worst system, but it's already corrupted, because honor, without wisdom to guide it, becomes vanity. Then comes oligarchy. The love of honor fades. What replaces it? Wealth. Plato describes a state where the rich rule and the poor are shut out entirely. Property qualifications determine power. And here's what he finds so dangerous. The city splits into 2, a city of the rich and a city of the poor, living side by side, always plotting against each other. The unity of the state is gone. And from that division, democracy emerges. The poor rise up, overthrow the rich, and distribute power equally. Freedom becomes the highest value. Everyone does what they want. Sounds appealing, right? Plato doesn't think so, but we'll get to that. Because democracy, he argues, leads to the final and worst regime, tyranny. The excess of freedom creates chaos, and from that chaos, a strong man rises, someone who promises order, someone the people choose, and once he has power, he never lets go. That's Plato's arc. Aristocracy to timocracy, timocracy to oligarchy, oligarchy to democracy, democracy to tyranny. Each regime collapses not from outside forces, but from its own internal contradictions. Every system carries the seed of its own destruction. Now, let's talk about democracy, because this is where Plato gets controversial. really controversial. Most people hear democracy and think, that's the good one. That's the system we fight for. That's freedom. But Plato, he ranks it second to last, just one step above tyranny. And he's not being dramatic, he means it. Plato argues that democracy is built on a flawed premise, that every person's opinion is equally valid when it comes to governing. He finds this absurd, and he makes his case with one of the most famous analogies in all of philosophy, the ship analogy. He asks, if you were on a ship in a dangerous storm, who would you want making decisions? The trained, experienced navigator? Or a vote among all the passengers, most of whom know nothing about sailing? The answer is obvious. But that, Plato says, is exactly what democracy does with the state. It hands the wheel to people who have no idea where they're going. And it goes deeper than just ignorance. Plato argues that democracy breeds a particular kind of character, the democratic soul, a person with no hierarchy of desires, no discipline, no structure. Every pleasure is treated as equal. Philosophy, junk entertainment, serious duty, idle amusement, all given the same weight. He describes the democratic person as someone who lives day by day, gratifying each appetite as it comes. No consistency, no direction. But here's what Plato sees as the real danger. Democracy's obsession with freedom and equality makes it uniquely vulnerable to manipulation. Demagogues, charismatic leaders who tell the crowd exactly what it wants to hear. Plato points out that in a democracy, the loudest voice wins, not the wisest, and the person who's best at flattering the masses rises to the top. Not the philosopher, not the expert, the performer. And that's the fatal move. Because the demagogue, once in power, doesn't stay a democrat. He becomes a tyrant. Plato is explicit about this. Tyranny is born directly out of democracy, not out of oligarchy, not out of timocracy, out of democracy. The freest society produces the most enslaved one. So when people call Plato anti-democratic, they're right, he is. But his critique isn't shallow. It's not elitist snobbery for the sake of it. It's a warning, a deeply reasoned, deeply uncomfortable warning about what happens when freedom operates without wisdom. Most people only know Plato from the Republic, the Philosopher-King, the ideal city, the grand, sweeping vision. But here's what they miss. Plato himself walked that vision back. Late in his life, he wrote the Laws, his last dialogue, his longest work, and in many ways, his most honest. Gone is the Philosopher-King. Gone is the perfectly governed city guided by a single enlightened soul. In the Laws, Plato argues for something far more grounded, the rule of law, not the rule of men. Law itself becomes sovereign, and that's a massive shift. In the Republic, Plato places his trust in the wisdom of one extraordinary individual. But in the Laws, he concedes something uncomfortable. That kind of person may never actually exist, or if they do, they can't be relied upon to stay uncorrupted. So what do? You build a system that doesn't depend on finding a perfect human being. Plato proposes a mixed constitution, a blend of monarchy and democracy. He argues that pure forms of government, whether total monarchy or total democracy, are inherently unstable. Monarchy slides into tyranny. Democracy slides into chaos. But blend them together. You get balance. You get durability. He also introduces the Nocturnal Council, a body of elder statesmen and educated citizens tasked with overseeing the state. Not philosopher-kings, guardians of the law. Their role isn't to rule by personal wisdom. It's to ensure the laws are upheld, interpreted, and refined over time. And Plato doesn't stop there.
He lays out detailed regulations on property ownership, on marriage, on education, on religious practice. Everything is structured. Everything is codified. The sweeping authority of the Philosopher-King is replaced by the discipline of a legal framework.
So why does this matter? Because it shows Plato wasn't rigid. He evolved. He looked at his own ideal and said, that's not enough. The Laws is Plato wrestling with reality, with human weakness, with the stubborn fact that people, left unchecked, tend toward eruption.
He doesn't abandon his belief in virtue, not at all. Education still sits at the heart of the state. Moral formation still matters deeply, but he wraps it inside a legal structure, because virtue alone, without law, isn't enough to hold a society together. The Laws isn't a retreat, it's a recalibration. Plato arguing that the best politics isn't about finding the perfect ruler, it's about building the right system, one that accounts for who we actually are, not who we wish we were. Here's one of the most provocative thought experiments in the entire history of philosophy, and it comes straight from Book 2 of Plato's Republic. Glaucon, Plato's own brother, tells the story. A shepherd discovers a ring inside a strange, hollow bronze horse buried in the earth. Not just any ring, a ring that makes him invisible. And what does the shepherd do with that power? He seduces the queen, kills the king, takes the throne. No consequences, no accountability, no one even knows. And then Glaucon throws down the challenge. He argues, if you gave this ring to a just man and an unjust man, they'd both behave exactly the same way. Both would lie, both would steal, both would do whatever served their own interest. Because the only reason people act justly? Fear. Fear of getting caught, fear of punishment, fear of losing reputation. Strip all that away, and justice vanishes. Now, Plato doesn't agree with this, not even close. But he lets the argument breathe. He lets it sit there, uncomfortable, demanding an answer. And his answer? It's the entire Republic. Plato argues, through Socrates, that justice is not some external costume you wear to avoid punishment. It's the internal order of the soul. A just person has harmony within, reason governing spirit, spirit governing appetite. And that harmony? That is the reward. The just person is genuinely happier, not because of what justice gets them, but because of what justice is. The unjust person, on the other hand, even with all the power, all the wealth, all the invisibility in the world, is internally fractured, chaotic, enslaved by appetites they can't control. Plato insists the man with the ring who acts unjustly isn't free at all. He's a slave to desire, a slave to impulse. The ring doesn't liberate him, it exposes him. And this carries enormous political weight, because if justice is only about fear of punishment, then the state is nothing more than a system of control. But if justice is intrinsically good, if it genuinely benefits the soul, then the state exists to cultivate that goodness, to educate, to shape citizens who choose to be just, not because someone's watching, but because justice is the natural condition of a well-ordered soul. That's Plato's answer to the ring, and it redefines what politics is even for. Most people hear the word justice, and they think fairness, equality, giving people what they deserve. Plato says, no, that's not it. Not even close. In the Republic, Plato redefines justice from the ground up. And his definition, it's not what anyone expects. He argues that justice is not about distributing things equally. It's not about balancing rights. It's about order, structure, everything in its proper place. Here's what he means. The ideal state has three classes: rulers, warriors, and producers. When each class does what it's naturally suited for, and only that, the state is just. Rulers govern with wisdom, warriors defend with courage, producers work with discipline. That's justice, not a courtroom verdict, not a social contract, a functioning hierarchy. And Plato doesn't stop at the state. He maps the exact same structure onto the individual soul. Reason must rule, spirit must support, appetite must obey. When that internal order holds, when reason sits on the throne and desire stays in check, the person is just. Justice for Plato is harmony, internal harmony. So what about the popular view, that justice is giving each person what they are owed? Plato confronts this head-on. He argues it's shallow. Surface level. It treats justice like a transaction, but Plato's justice runs deeper than that. It's not about what you give or get, it's about what you are, where you stand, what role you fulfill. And then there's Thrasymachus, one of the sharpest challengers in the Republic. He throws down a bold claim. Justice is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger. The powerful make the rules, and they call it justice. That's it. Raw power dressed up in moral language. Plato's Socrates doesn't flinch. He dismantles this argument piece by piece. He shows that a ruler who serves only himself isn't ruling at all. He's a tyrant. A true ruler, Plato argues, governs for the good of the governed, not for personal gain, not for control, for the health of the whole. But here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Plato's justice is not democratic. It's hierarchical. It assumes people are not equal in ability or function, and it insists, unapologetically, that the wise should lead and the rest should follow. That's not a popular idea. Plato never cared about popularity. This is the one that shocks people. Plato, one of the greatest writers in the history of philosophy, wanted to ban poets from his ideal state, not tax them, not regulate them, remove them. And he wasn't being reckless. He had a reason, a deeply philosophical one. In the Republic, Plato argues that art is imitation, but not just imitation, it's imitation of an imitation. Here's the logic. The world we see around us, it's already a copy, a shadow of the true reality, the forms. A bed you can touch is just a reflection of the form of the bed. Now, a painter who paints that bed, he's copying a copy, 2 steps removed from truth. And that, for Plato, is dangerous. But it's not just about distance from truth. It's about what art does to the soul. Plato argues that poetry and drama stir up emotions. They bypass reason. They feed the irrational part of the soul, the part that craves fear, grief, anger, desire. And when that part gets fed, it grows stronger. Reason weakens. The soul falls out of balance. He's especially concerned about the young. Children are impressionable. They absorb stories before they can think critically about them. And Plato points out, what are those stories teaching? He singles out Homer. He singles out the tragedians. Their gods lie, cheat, and fight. Their heroes weep and rage. Death is portrayed as something terrifying. These depictions, Plato warns, corrupt character at the root. Now, here's what's interesting. Plato isn't anti-art in some crude, narrow sense. He himself uses myth. He uses allegory. The allegory of the cave? That's a literary device. He knows the power of storytelling, and that's exactly why he wants to control it. Because he understands, better than most, that stories shape souls. His position is clear. Art must serve truth. Art must serve the state. The moment it becomes mere entertainment,
The moment it flatters emotion instead of strengthening reason, it becomes a threat. And who decides what art is acceptable? Plato's answer is blunt: the Philosopher-King, the one who sees the forms, the one who knows what's true. It raises an uncomfortable question, one that's haunted every society since. Who gets to draw the line between art and propaganda? Plato drew it, and he drew it with absolute confidence. This is probably the most famous passage in all of Western philosophy, and there's a reason it survived for over 2,000 years. It cuts deep. In Book 7 of the Republic, Plato paints a scene: people chained inside a cave since birth. They can't turn their heads. All they see are shadows on the wall, shadows cast by objects behind them, lit by a fire they've never seen. And here's the thing: these prisoners don't know they're looking at shadows. They think the shadows are reality. They name them, they argue about them, they build entire lives around them. Plato's point is brutal. Most people live like this. Not in a cave, obviously, but trapped inside a world of appearances, opinions, half-truths, and completely convinced that what they see is all there is. But then one prisoner breaks free. He turns around, sees the fire, his eyes burn. He stumbles out of the cave and into sunlight. And at first, he's blinded. The truth is painful. It's disorienting. He can barely look at anything. But slowly, his eyes adjust. He sees real objects, real colors, and then the sun itself, the source of all light, the source of all truth. For Plato, the sun represents the form of the good, the highest reality, the thing that makes everything else intelligible. And the journey out of the cave, that's philosophy, that's education. Not in the sense of memorizing facts, but in the sense of turning the entire soul toward what is real. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. Plato says the freed prisoner must go back into the cave, back to the darkness, back to the people still in chains. And when he tries to tell them what he's seen, they don't believe him. They mock him. They think he's the one who's lost his mind. Plato argues that this is the fate of the philosopher in society. The one who sees clearly is rejected by those who are comfortable in ignorance. And not just rejected, Plato warns that they'd kill him if they could. That's not hypothetical. He's thinking of Socrates, the man who told Athens the truth, and Athens executed him for it. The allegory isn't just a story, it's a diagnosis. And Plato is saying, most of us are still sitting in that cave, staring at shadows, calling them real. This is one of the most chilling arguments Plato makes, and it sounds counterintuitive at first, but stay with it, because the logic is razor sharp. In Book 8 of the Republic, Plato traces how political systems decay, and the most dangerous collapse, he argues, is the one from democracy into tyranny. Not from oppression into tyranny, from freedom into tyranny. That's the part most people miss. Plato describes democracy as a society drunk on liberty. Everyone does what they want. Authority is mocked. Teachers fear their students. Parents try to be friends with their children. No one wants to be told what to do. And on the surface, it looks like paradise. Choice everywhere, no constraints, total freedom. But Plato sees something darker underneath. He argues that excessive freedom creates a void. When no one respects structure, when every boundary is seen as oppression, when discipline is treated as tyranny, society loses its center. People stop being guided by reason and start being ruled by appetite, by impulse, by whatever feels good right now. And in that chaos, Plato says, a figure rises, the tyrant. He doesn't come wearing a crown. He comes as a champion of the people, a protector, someone who says, "I'll fight for you, I'll take on the elites, I'll fix everything." And the masses, exhausted by disorder, desperate for stability, hand him power willingly. That's Plato's warning. The tyrant doesn't seize power by force. He's given it. Freely, democratically even, the very freedom people celebrated becomes the doorway through which tyranny walks in. And once the tyrant has control, Plato describes the progression coldly. First, he eliminates rivals. Then he starts wars to keep the people distracted and dependent. Then he surrounds himself with loyalists and mercenaries. And the citizens who once cheered for him, they become his slaves. Plato isn't making a case against freedom itself. He's making a case against unrestrained freedom, freedom without wisdom, freedom without self-discipline, freedom that refuses to recognize any authority above personal desire. He points out that the freest society and the most enslaved society are closer than anyone wants to admit, and the distance between them, it's shorter than you think. Now, this is where Plato's political philosophy takes a turn that most people aren't ready for. In the Republic, Plato doesn't just sketch out an ideal state, he engineers one, and part of that engineering involves something deeply uncomfortable: eugenics, state-controlled reproduction, deliberate, calculated breeding of citizens. Plato argues that the guardians, the ruling class, shouldn't be free to marry or reproduce as they please. No, the state decides who mates with whom. And the goal is simple: breed the best possible human beings. He draws a direct comparison to animal husbandry, the way a breeder selects the strongest dogs, the fastest horses. Plato believes the state should do exactly the same with people. He even proposes rigged mating festivals, events designed to look random, spontaneous, but behind the scenes, every pairing is carefully selected by the rulers to produce superior offspring. And it gets darker. Plato suggests that children born from unapproved unions, or those born with defects, should be quietly removed, hidden away, disposed of. He doesn't flinch when he says this. He calls it a necessary falsehood, a lie told for the good of the city. And that idea, the justified lie, connects to something even bigger in Plato's system, the noble lie. Plato argues that rulers aren't just permitted to deceive the people, they're obligated to. If a myth, a fabricated story, a carefully constructed narrative can hold the city together, then it's not just acceptable, it's essential. So propaganda in Plato's framework isn't a corruption of politics, it's a feature, a deliberate tool of governance. He argues that everything, education, art, music, poetry, should be censored, curated, shaped to promote loyalty, virtue, and obedience from childhood. Nothing left to chance, nothing left to individual interpretation. Why? Because Plato doesn't trust people to find truth on their own. He believes most human beings are too easily pulled by emotion, by desire, by false belief. They can't be left to wander intellectually. The state must guide them, steer them, even if that means lying to them every single day of their lives. This is Plato at his most authoritarian, and he makes no apology for it. In his view, the alternative, a population left to its own confused emotional reasoning, is far worse than any lie the state could ever tell. Plato's critique of democracy is without question one of the sharpest in the history of political thought, and it's not subtle. He doesn't see democracy as the pinnacle of human freedom. He sees it as a slow-moving disaster. In the Republic, Plato offers a metaphor that cuts deep. He compares a democratic state to a ship. Every passenger on the ship demands a turn at the helm. Everyone wants to steer. But here's the thing. Nobody stops to ask whether the person grabbing the wheel actually knows how to navigate. No one checks for skill. No one checks for knowledge. The loudest voice wins, not the wisest. And that, Plato argues, is the fatal flaw of democracy. It treats every opinion as equal. The ignorant voice carries the same weight as the informed one. The mob shouts down the expert, and the ship drifts, or worse, crashes. But Plato doesn't stop there. He warns that democratic citizens become drunk on personal freedom. They resist authority. They reject discipline. They celebrate individual expression above collective order. And while that might create a society that looks vibrant, culturally alive, full of diversity, Plato argues it's politically hollow, unstable at its core. And from that instability, tyranny. Plato maps this out like a diagnosis. The tyrant doesn't seize power through brute force. He rises through charm, through populism. He presents himself as a man of the people, a defender of freedom. But once he's in, once the crowd has handed him the wheel, his true nature emerges. He's driven by appetite, consumed by paranoia, and he enslaves the very people who lifted him up. This isn't abstract theory for Plato, it's personal. He watched the Athenian democracy put Socrates on trial. He watched them sentence the wisest man he ever knew to death. Not because Socrates was wrong, but because the majority didn't like what he had to say. That moment shaped everything. For Plato, the death of Socrates wasn't just a tragedy, it was evidence. Proof that democracy doesn't just risk inefficiency, it risks something far worse. It can destroy the very wisdom it needs to survive, simply because the crowd voted to do so. This is where Plato loses most people, and honestly, it's not hard to see why. In the Republic, he proposes something that even his contemporaries found shocking. The guardian class, the rulers and warriors, must have no private families, no marriages, no personal attachment to children, none. Plato argues that the family is the single greatest source of division in the state. When people have wives, husbands, children of their own, loyalty fractures. You stop caring about the city. You start caring about your household, your bloodline, your inheritance. And that, for Plato, is the beginning of corruption. So he eliminates it completely. He envisions a system of communal mating and communal child-rearing. Guardians reproduce at state-sanctioned festivals. The pairings are arranged, not by love, not by choice, but by a calculated selection process designed to produce the best offspring. Eugenics, plain and simple. Plato doesn't shy away from the word's implications, even if the word itself didn't exist yet. And once children are born, they're taken immediately, raised collectively by the state. No parent knows which child is theirs. No child knows who their parents are. Everyone in the guardian class refers to every older person as mother or father, every peer as brother or sister. Why? Because Plato believes this will produce unity, total, unbreakable unity. If no one has a private family, no one has a private interest. The city becomes the family. The state becomes the bond. He points out that personal attachments breed favoritism, nepotism, faction. A ruler who loves his own son more than the city's welfare is a ruler already compromised. So Plato removes the temptation altogether. And here's the part people rarely mention. He applies this equally to women. Women of the guardian class receive the same education, the same training, the same responsibilities as men. Plato argues that sex is irrelevant to the capacity for reason or courage. A woman can be a philosopher-king just as readily as a man. Progressive on gender, totalitarian on family. That's the paradox. It's easy to dismiss this as dystopian fantasy, but Plato isn't writing carelessly. He's following his logic to its absolute end. If the greatest threat to political unity is private loyalty, then private loyalty must be destroyed. Cold? Absolutely. But Plato doesn't care about comfort. He cares about the just city. And in his just city, the family has no place. Every state rests on a story. Plato just says it out loud. In Book 3 of the Republic, he introduces one of the most provocative concepts in political philosophy, the noble lie, a myth, a foundational fiction, told to every citizen from birth, designed not to deceive for personal gain, but to hold the city together. Here's the lie. Plato proposes telling the people that they were all born from the earth itself, that the land they live on is literally their mother, and that during their formation beneath the ground, the gods mixed different metals into their souls: gold for the rulers, silver for the warriors, bronze and iron for the producers. So your place in society isn't arbitrary, it's natural, ordained, written into your very being. Plato argues that this myth serves a critical function. It gives citizens a reason to accept the social hierarchy, not through force, but through belief. If people genuinely believe their role in the city reflects their soul's composition, they won't resist it, they won't resent it, they'll embrace it. And he's very deliberate about calling it a lie. He doesn't pretend it's true. He doesn't dress it up as revelation. He knows it's fabricated. But he argues that some lies are necessary, that a society without a binding myth, without a shared narrative that grounds identity and duty, will tear itself apart. This is where Plato gets uncomfortable, because he's essentially saying that truth, the thing philosophers are supposed to pursue above all else, must sometimes be sacrificed for stability. The philosopher sees the truth, the citizen gets the story, and the gap between the two, that's the price of order. But who benefits from this lie? The rulers, always the rulers. They know the myth is false. They crafted it, and they maintain it generation after generation, because it keeps the city functioning. Plato doesn't see this as manipulation. He sees it as medicine, a necessary fiction that prevents chaos. But the implications are staggering. He's giving the ruling class a permanent justification for inequality, and he's embedding it not in law, but in identity. Every empire, every nation, every political order has its own version of the noble lie, a founding myth, a sacred origin story. Plato simply had the nerve to admit it was invented, and that admission, that honesty about dishonesty, is what makes the idea so unsettling. He warns us in plain terms that power always needs a story. The only question is whether we recognize the fiction or live inside it. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato lays out one of his most striking analogies, the allegory of the ship, and it cuts right to the heart of why he despises democratic rule. Here's how it goes. Plato asks us to consider a ship. The owner of the ship is large and strong, but partially deaf, partially blind, and knows very little about navigation. The sailors on board are all fighting with each other over who should steer. Every one of them believes they deserve the helm. None of them have ever studied navigation. None of them even believe navigation is something that can be taught. And if anyone suggests that there's an actual skill involved in steering a ship, they mock him, call him a stargazer, useless. Meanwhile, the true navigator,
The one who actually understands the stars, the winds, the seasons, sits ignored, dismissed, irrelevant. That's Plato's picture of democracy. The ship is the state. The sailors are the citizens and politicians, loud, ambitious, unqualified. And the navigator? That's the philosopher, the one person who actually knows how to steer. But no one's listening. Plato argues that ruling a city requires knowledge, real knowledge, not popularity, not charisma, not wealth, skill. The same way you wouldn't let a random passenger fly a plane, Plato insists you shouldn't let an untrained mob govern a state. It's not just inefficient, it's catastrophic. And here's what makes this allegory so sharp. Plato isn't just saying that philosophers happen to be good rulers. He's saying that governance is a craft, a techne. It demands years of training, discipline, and intellectual development. You don't vote your way into competence, you earn it. He points out that in every other domain of life, we defer to experts. You go to a doctor when you're sick, a shipbuilder when you need a vessel. But when it comes to the most important thing, the direction of the entire city, suddenly everyone's opinion counts equally. Plato finds this absurd, dangerously absurd. The allegory isn't subtle. It's a direct attack on the Athenian democratic model. Plato watched Athens hand power to demagogues. He watched them sentence Socrates to death. And he concluded, with absolute conviction, that a state governed by the uninformed is a state headed for the rocks. Expertise isn't optional. For Plato, it's the only thing standing between order and shipwreck. In books 8 and 9 of the Republic, Plato does something remarkable. He maps out the rise and fall of political systems, not randomly, but as a sequence, a downward spiral. Each regime decaying into something worse, and every collapse driven by the same thing, the corruption of the soul. It starts with aristocracy, rule by the best, the philosopher-kings. This is Plato's ideal, the just city governed by wisdom and reason. But even this, he admits, won't last forever. Why? Because over time, even the best rulers make errors in judgment. The wrong people get selected, cracks form, and the city begins its descent. The first fall is into timocracy, rule by those who love honor. The military class rises. Spirit replaces reason. Courage is still there, but wisdom? Fading. The rulers in a timocracy care more about glory and reputation than truth. Plato points to Sparta as a real-world example. Strong? Yes, but not wise, and that's a problem. Then comes oligarchy. The love of honor gives way to the love of wealth. Now money determines power. The rich rule. The poor are excluded. Society splits into two cities, one of the wealthy, one of the destitute. Plato warns that this division breeds resentment, deep, festering resentment, and it's only a matter of time before it explodes. And explode it does, into democracy. The poor rise up, they overthrow the oligarchs, freedom becomes the supreme value. Everyone does what they want. Sounds appealing, right? Plato doesn't think so. He argues that democracy is intoxicating, but hollow. It treats all desires as equal, all opinions as valid. There's no hierarchy of knowledge, no structure, no discipline. The democratic soul, Plato says, is ruled by appetite. It chases pleasure after pleasure with no direction. And here's the final turn. Out of that chaos, that unchecked freedom, the tyrant emerges. Plato argues that tyranny is born from democracy, not despite it, because of it. The people, desperate for order, hand power to a strong man, a protector. And that protector slowly becomes a monster. He enslaves the very people who elevated him. That's the full arc. Aristocracy to timocracy, timocracy to oligarchy, oligarchy to democracy, democracy to tyranny. Each step a degradation, each regime a mirror of a deteriorating soul. Plato doesn't present this as speculation. He presents it as inevitable, unless philosophy governs.
Here's something people forget. Plato's hatred of democracy wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. It was personal. Democracy killed his teacher. Socrates, the man Plato considered the wisest person in Athens, was put on trial by a democratic jury. The charges? Corrupting the youth, impiety, vague accusations driven by political resentment and personal grudges.
And what happened? 500 ordinary citizens voted, and the majority chose death. Not exile, not a fine, death. That moment shaped everything Plato wrote about politics. Everything.
He watched the democratic system take the one man who actually cared about truth, the one man who challenged people to think, and execute him, not because he was guilty, but because he made people uncomfortable, because he asked too many questions, because the crowd didn't like what he had to say. So when Plato attacks democracy, he's not speaking from some ivory tower. He's speaking from grief, from rage, from the lived experience of watching a mob make the worst possible decision and call it justice. But Plato doesn't stop at emotion. He builds a philosophical case, and it's devastating. He argues that democracy treats all opinions as equal, but they're not. Governing requires knowledge, skill, training. You wouldn't let a random crowd perform surgery. You wouldn't let passengers vote on how to fly a plane. So why, Plato asks, do we let untrained, uninformed citizens decide the fate of an entire state? And then there's the problem of desire. Plato argues that democracy elevates freedom above everything else. Sounds noble, but in practice, it means no one accepts authority. No one submits to discipline. Children disrespect teachers. Students ignore their mentors. Citizens resist any form of structure. The whole society becomes allergic to order. He also warns about what democracy does to leadership. It doesn't reward wisdom. It rewards charm, persuasion, spectacle. The democratic leader isn't chosen because he knows the most. He's chosen because he performs the best. He tells people what they want to hear. And Plato sees this as a death sentence for any serious governance. So, was Plato just bitter about Socrates? Partly, yes. But his critique runs far deeper than personal loss. He saw structural flaws in democracy that he believed made collapse inevitable. Not possible, inevitable, and he never backed down from that position. This is the question that won't go away. 24 centuries later, and Plato's warnings still sting. Look at what he predicted. Democratic societies would prioritize freedom over competence. Leaders would rise not through wisdom, but through spectacle and flattery. Citizens would become so consumed by personal desires that they'd lose sight of the common good. The loudest voices would drown out the wisest ones. Does any of that sound familiar? Plato argued that democracies would produce a specific kind of citizen, someone with no internal order, no hierarchy of values, a person who chases whatever feels good in the moment, who treats every opinion as equally valid, who resists any authority that limits personal freedom. He described this over 2,000 years ago, and yet it reads like a diagnosis of modern political culture. He also warned about the demagogue, the charismatic figure who exploits democratic freedoms to seize power. Someone who rises by channeling public anger, who promises to be the voice of the people, and who, once in control, dismantles the very system that elevated him. Plato didn't just predict this as a possibility, he presented it as the natural outcome of unchecked democracy. And here's what's uncomfortable. History has proven him right, again and again. Athens itself fell into tyranny after its democratic golden age. The Roman Republic collapsed into dictatorship. Modern democracies have watched populist leaders exploit the very freedoms that define open societies. But, and this matters, Plato wasn't entirely right either. His solution was rule by philosopher-kings, an elite class of enlightened rulers who govern without consent from the governed. No elections, no public debate, no accountability to the people. And that vision carries its own dangers. Who decides who the philosophers are? Who watches the watchers? Plato never adequately answers that. He places enormous faith in education and selection, but history shows that unchecked elite rule leads to its own forms of corruption and abuse. So the honest assessment? Plato's diagnosis of democracy's weaknesses is razor sharp, maybe the sharpest ever written. But his prescription, a rigid, hierarchical state ruled by an unelected intellectual class, raises as many problems as it solves. He saw the disease clearly, but the cure he offered? That's still up for debate.